So hi guys, as I said before, my name's Chris Harmston. I'm a general surgeon here in Whangarei. I've been here 18 and I'm really pleased that I'm going to talk to you this evening with, and we're going to talk to you about trauma data. And when I say trauma data, I really mean trauma data collection in a national sense of what we collect. And I just want to answer 3 key questions for you, hopefully in the next 15 minutes, so that you can go and get some food. The first one is, why do we collect trauma data? The second is, how and what do we collect? And the third is, what do we do with trauma data that we collect? And when I talk about why we collect trauma data, I'm not talking philosophically. I'm talking about why we collect trauma data in Northland and in Whangarei Hospital. And to answer that, we just need to know a little bit about the history of how trauma is organised in New Zealand, and it gives us a good opportunity just to learn something about the National Major Trauma Network. So traditionally in New Zealand, trauma care was organised hospital by hospital, like it was elsewhere in the world. But there became a new standard of care for patients with trauma, which was through the provision of trauma networks, really guided by the US, then in Canada, Australia and the United Kingdom. And trauma networks were organised in a pretty simple manner. You identified trauma centres, you moved patients with major injuries to that trauma centre, and then you created guidelines and measured your outputs. But New Zealand was slow to adapt a national trauma system. But in 2009, the Quality Improvement Committee, mostly from influence from Auckland Hospital, specifically Ian Civil, who became the chair of the Major Trauma Network, recommended a national trauma system for New Zealand. And that was followed by a review from the then Health Board that looked at how trauma care was provided in New Zealand. And anybody who was providing trauma care in New Zealand at the time, I suspect, already knew the answers. And what they found was that trauma care was variable from centre to centre, outcomes were variable from centre to centre, and mortality was about 20% for major trauma. And the best trauma systems in the world at that time had a mortality of probably below 10%. So after a review, that led to the formation of the Major Trauma Clinical Network in 2012, which was chaired by Ian Civil. And it had a fairly simple but really important aim. The aim of the Major Trauma National Clinical Network was to reduce preventable mortality, morbidity and long-term disability in patients suffering from major trauma. And the initial way of achieving that was to do 3 things. First of all, establish a formal trauma structure system across New Zealand. The second thing was to establish a New Zealand trauma registry. So to establish a registry where we can collect data nationally on patients suffering from major trauma. And the third was to develop consistent guidelines and plans for the treatment of managing major trauma in New Zealand. So there's now a national network for major trauma. There's 4 regional trauma networks, North, Midlands, Central and South. It's funded by ACC and the Ministry of Health, and since 2015, more so the ACC. So the answer to why we collect trauma data in Northland, in Whangarei and nationally is really quite simple. We collect it because there's a national mandate via the Major Trauma Clinical Networks. And we do that for a very simple reason. We do it because in New Zealand we want to reduce the rate of preventable mortality, morbidity and long-term disability in patients who've suffered major trauma. So I'm just going to hand over to Olivia now, who's going to talk to you about how we collect the data and what data we collect that goes onto the National Trauma Registry.
Kia ora everyone, I'm Olivia and I'm a registered nurse here at Northland District Health Board. I did my training here at Whangarei Hospital back in the late 90s, and I've been back here for 3 years, and I've been in my current role, for about half that time. And and I'm the trauma data collector and data analyst here at Whangarei Hospital. And which button do I press? The red one?
There should be just two on there. Just press left and right. Yeah, there you go.
And so here at Northland we have me, designated trauma data analyst. I do 8 hours a week collecting and inputting our trauma data. And I'm located in the orthopaedic ward here at Whangarei. What do we collect? Major trauma. Who's included? Currently we're collecting all major trauma and moderates that meet our criteria, that are admitted from ED, deceased in the department, or transferred onto another DHB. Who's excluded? The exclusion criteria is it's set by the Midlands Trauma Centre. They run the National Registry. That's the exclusion criteria, you can see it there. And how's data gathered here? We data gather the management information services. They generate a report daily at 0200 hours, and then we have a couple of ways of cross-checking that. So definition, bit of definition here. At Northland we're currently collecting all major trauma. That's defined by the Midlands with ISS injury severity score of more than 12. So these patient group have major trauma in at least one body region or moderate trauma in 2 or more body regions. It's now a Ministry of Health requirement for all patients with major trauma to be entered into this National Registry within 30 days of discharge. And we're also collecting moderate trauma here. This patient group has an injury severity score between 9 and 12, and they have multiple moderate trauma in a singular body region, and we're just housing that here in paper form at the moment. Data collection sources. Oh yes, if anyone's interested, I brought copies of the trauma form when I collect the points I collect. So you can have a look. It didn't come up very good on the screen. So where I get the forms from, the info from, I get them from Concerto, or the demographic details of the CT reports, ED times, surgical procedures, ambulance reports, the injury time, location, and mechanism of injury, which I also check in the ED notes, if they're restrained, if they're trapped, their position in the vehicle, if airbags are deployed, if they lose consciousness. ED notes, this is a really valuable source of information. It's not electronic, it's not recorded elsewhere, and it's very clinician dependent. And I want to take this time to thank the Whangarei ED doctors and nurses and say this is usually very well done. And I also want to do a quick plug and just define the things that I gained from the ED documentation. Whether or not there was a trauma call, this is really important. Any procedures performed in ED, like emergency thoracotomy and chest drain insertion, fast scans, if they've had a fast scan, what the result is, intubation times, mechanism of ventilation, if they've had a massive transfusion protocol. These are things that they're not in Concerto, and they're just handwritten in the ED form. Very important. Destination post-ED and their OBS. And I also look at the ICU notes and the ward notes. And these things are audited nationally for all the major traumas that are entered into the database. Alcohol levels, if it's measured in the trauma patients. And time to CT from admission, which is ideally 2 hours. So I just want to explain a little bit about coding, because I find it very interesting. So every injury has an abbreviated injury scale, and that's found referring in the AIS dictionary. And that was a dictionary developed by the Association for Advancement of Automotive Medicine. So they've been coding injuries, looking at patterns of injuries, and altering vehicles accordingly to reduce injuries, like things like removing the little wind-up thing that we used to wind our windows up to get rid of all the thoracic injuries. And so for a fractured neck of femur, or not a neck of femur, shaft of femur, you look in the dictionary, and fractured shaft of femur, that's the code that comes up. So it's see the point in the 3, so it's got an AIS of 3. And then so to calculate the injury severity score, the ISS, to see if it's a major or not, take the highest AAS from each body region. So say for this list of 3 injuries, if the patient have those 3 injuries, so you take they've got 2 injuries in the lower body region, so you take the fractured shaft of femur because it's the highest, and you take the other injury, the retina detachment, it's a 2, and you square the highest AIS in each body region. So fractured shaft of femur, so AIS of 3, so you square it, you get a 9, and the other one, square it, get a 2, and then you add the body regions, so you get an ISS of 13. So that would be for Midlands, for the registry, that is a major trauma, so that would be collected. And that's what he would be. And I'll hand you back to Chris to tell us about the data and what it's being used for.
Thanks, Olivia. If you have got one of those data sheets, it's really worth having a look at it to see how much information is now being collected on major trauma patients nationally in Whangarei, and also how much data is being potentially be able to collect on patients with non-major trauma. I think it's really important for the clinicians, ambulance staff, etc., to realise that Olivia looks at all this data, and it means our documentation is really, really important. So, how do we use the data? I'm just going to take 2 or 3 minutes just to quickly talk you through some of the data outputs that have come from the National Registry. And everything that I tell you about today will be taken from the annual report of the Major Trauma National Clinical Network. And this report was published early this year for 2015 to 2016. And I'll try and do this in 2 or 3 minutes so that we can go and get something to eat. There's 2 things that you should be aware of with regards to the trauma registry before we go any further. The first thing is that it's relatively immature. There's just a year of data input. So any statistics that we get from it will be descriptive. The second thing to know is that in the south, trauma input's been delayed, the data's been delayed. So actually the data that I'll present is just from the North Island. That means it's possible it may be skewed. The North Island tends to have the more mature trauma systems, so some of the data may change as when the south start to put data into the trauma registry. But so far there's 1,300 patients in the trauma registry. It's expected that when the South Island comes on board, there'll be 2,000 patients a year going into the trauma registry. So it has the potential to become a really powerful resource. And these are just some headlines from the national report. So what's the incidence of major trauma? Just over 40 per 100,000. That's totally in keeping with what's seen in other modern healthcare systems. US, Canada, Australia and UK, always around 40 per 100,000. The overall mortality from major trauma for the North Island for that year was 9%. So already half what it was when it was reviewed back in 2009. But still lower than the 6% that's being seen elsewhere around the world. And the third headline for me, and I think for us in Whangarei, is that 21% of patients were transferred within the first 72 hours. So 1 in 5 patients gets transferred within the first 72 hours. And I think this statistic will act as a benchmark so that we can see how initiatives such as the Major Trauma Destination Policy, which is being rolled out, has an effect on if we're getting patients with certain injuries to the right hospital straight away. There's a slight regional variation in incidence of major trauma. So the Midlands region has a slightly higher incidence of major trauma than northern or central regions. In terms of mechanism of injury, I've just put this on for the northern region. It's pretty much the same across all regions. As expected, just over half of injuries due to road traffic accidents, then falls, and then assault. And I always think it's interesting that within road traffic accidents, injuries to pedestrians and cyclists, so 10 and 6%. So a reasonable proportion of road traffic accidents involve pedestrians and people on bikes. And if you look at the data as a whole, you can start to identify three groups of patients. Young patients, 20s, motor vehicle accidents and assaults. Middle-aged patients, mixture of injuries, falls, motorcycle accidents, interestingly, and motor vehicle accidents. And then older patients, those aged over 75, with falls and MVAs. So basically, the number of falls increases, and assaults tend to be a problem in the younger population. There's definitely an ethnicity disparity. These are numbers per 100,000. So Maori have far more major trauma comparatively than other ethnicities. And Helena will show you some data later on from Northland just about ages in those different groups as well. And finally, injury severity. This slide just shows the different proportions of patients with different injury severities. So on the right hand, on your left hand side is the yellow band. They're patients who are expected to survive. The middle band is the orange band. They're patients with an expected mortality of about 30%. And on your right, the green band are the severely injured patients with a mortality of over 50%. And you can see that proportions are mildly comparable, although the central region, again, has a higher proportion of severely injured patients. And that may act as a focus for further research. So how do we use data? Well, already there's been published outputs from the trauma registry. They've allowed a focus for areas of improvement. And I think most importantly in the first instance, they allow benchmarking of performance with regards to both mortality, morbidity, disability and movement of patients. So I hope that myself and Olivia have answered those three questions, and that now you know, firstly, why we collect trauma data, secondly, how and what we collect, and thirdly, how we use it and learn some broad outcomes from the annual report from the Major Trauma National Clinical Network.